Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 1st of February 2016, Afshin Shahi discussed the Middle East, identity and sectarian violence.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorraine. I'm really impressed with the turnout. When I was on my way from Bradford to Newcastle, I wasn't expecting to see many people tonight because the weather has been extremely unfriendly over the last few days. So I'm really impressed with the turnout. Welcome. I have a very, very difficult task. I have only 20 minutes to tackle some of the most pressing issues of our time. Lorraine, in her introduction, talked about, for example, the rise of transnational jihadi networks. She talked about ISIS. She talked about sectarian violence and the Middle East refugee crisis, Syria. And each of these topics obviously require hours and hours of elucidation and discussion. But my task this evening is to kind of provoke at least some questions about the rise of something very new, at least to mainstream Western audience, which is kind of Islamic sectarianism. Probably some of you may remember or may not remember what you were doing on 17th of December 2010. Probably vast majority of you don't remember, but that day was one of the most important and defining days of the modern history. Can anybody guess what happened that day? You couldn't expect that, but somebody with the name of Mohammed Bouazizi, somebody who wasn't even about to make history, he was a street vendor in a very unknown and insignificant town in North Africa, in Tunisia. On that very fateful day, his goods were confiscated by the authorities, and in the way of protest, he set himself on fire. Maybe this was a very spontaneous act. Maybe he thought about it before, we don't know. But what we know is that resulted in one of the most important paradigm shifts of the 21st century so far, and that was the so-called Arab uprising. In the matter of months, some of the most entrenched authoritarian kind of figures, like Ben Ali in Tunisia, or like Mubarak for that matter. I lived in Egypt for a while, and I never ever could imagine a day would come that Mubarak would be pushed out of power. After all, Mubarak ruled Egypt longer than any other Egyptian ruler since Ramses II. He was just part of the furniture. Nonetheless, in the matter of a few months, we saw some incredible things happening. There was this climate of euphoria. People called what was happening Arab Spring. And of course, if you do look at the European literature, when we talk about the springtime of people, we talk about, probably we are making references to maybe attempt for liberalization, democratization, or at least resisting dictatorship and authoritarianism. There was basically a lot of expectation that finally this so-called Arab exceptionalism is going to be challenged, and the Middle East, which is considered as the least democratic region in the international system, so finally can pave the way to democratization. But very soon that climate of euphoria, that climate of excitement faded away. Not only we didn't see a transition to democracy, not only we didn't see transition to democratization and at least political liberalization, we started to see a new phenomenon. And probably until 4 or 5 years ago, most of you probably didn't know a lot about the political differences between the Shiite branch of, or the theological difference for that matter, Islam, and the Sunni, because it wasn't in the news. Unless you were interested in Middle East politics or Islamic history, so you were doing your own studies, so you knew about it. So in the matter of a year or so, all of a sudden, the news basically immersed about kind of the sectarian violence. Let me kind of give you a little bit of context, because what I'm going to talk about for the remaining 15 minutes is specifically about the Middle East and kind of the rise of sectarian violence in the Middle East. But the Middle East constitute a very insignificant part of the Muslim world. Of course, this is hard to believe, but a very insignificant part of the Muslim population worldwide live in the Middle East. Nonetheless, anytime anybody mentions the Muslim world, the first region that leaps into our mind is the Middle East. More Muslims living in India than the entirety of the GCC countries in the Middle East. And actually, vast majority of Muslims lived in Asia Pacific. Nonetheless, the Middle East is extremely important, because what happens in the Middle East has an impact on the wider so-called Muslim consciousness. Despite the fact that a very kind of insignificant population, a very insignificant segment of the Muslim population worldwide live in the Middle East, but the Muslim community in the Middle East is divided on ethnic lines, on the tribal kind of lines, and sectarian. Roughly about 40% of the region are Shiites, and the rest are Sunnis. But again, this is not a clear kind of divide, because we don't have a clear category called Shiites, because Shiites themselves are divided into so many different isms. And Sunnis, again, are divided into so many different kind of sections. So we're dealing with a very kind of complex picture. Over the last few years, a lot of people have been naively trying to explain the war in Syria on sectarian kind of lines, explaining that, for example, countries like Iran is supporting a country like Syria simply because they're both Shiites. And I keep telling that if a member of the Alawite community in Syria, which we kind of in the West know them as Shiite, if he goes to Iran and preach his creed, he will be arrested on the ground of heresy. So basically the theological connections are very insignificant. We don't have enough time to talk about kind of the historical kind of context for this kind of divide between the Sunnis and Shiites. But this has been going on for basically 1400 years. Islamic sectarianism is as old as Islam itself, so there isn't anything new about it. But what I'm going to do this evening is primarily talk about the ways in which it became a political issue again in the 21st century. So I want to talk about 4 phases of transition in brief, and then after the break we're going to kind of explore these phases in details. I often tell my students that 1979 was the first year of the 21st century. Because a lot of the issues that we are facing at the moment, a lot of the important security impediments that we are facing today, things like the refugee crisis that has divided Europe, things like the rise of transnational jihadism, things like the rise of Salafism, for that matter, is rooted in 1979. 1979 is one of the most important turning points in the living memory, because some extremely important things, apart from the fact that Margaret Thatcher was elected on the same year, but in the Middle East, some extremely important things happened in Middle East and Central Asia. The first thing was the Iranian Revolution, which probably some of you may remember. That was one of the most important turning points in modern history of the Middle East, because once again it brought political Islam into the forefront of the agenda. Remember, most of the 20th century, certainly after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, in the Middle East, Islam wasn't playing a significant role in the public sphere. The most important, I suppose, occupation for the Arab activists were nationalism. People who wanted to, shape or reshape the world. They were kind of interpreting and evaluating the world through the lenses of Marxism, nationalism, communism. So primarily, kind of the intellectual occupation was something very different from Islamism. Of course, it is very difficult to look at the Middle East today and think of the time that Islamism or political Islam wasn't the main frame of reference for politics. But nonetheless, this is a relatively new phenomenon. And 1979, in my opinion, was kind of the turning point. The Iranian Revolution, which wasn't supposed to be about Islamism, nonetheless facilitated the infrastructure, paved the way for the emergence of an Islamist government and eventually the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that was a very, very important turning point. And the other important event was the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. And I'm sure most of you know about the details, what happened exactly. And for the first time in modern history, in Afghanistan, a platform was created for transnational jihadism. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and United States actively and openly welcomed the so-called jihadis to come from all over the Muslim world in Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union. And very much what we see today, this kind of interesting creature that we identify as ISIS or the Islamic State, has its root in basically in the 1980s in Afghanistan. Of course, the third factor was the recognition of the State of Israel by Egypt. Egypt was the mother of the Arab world, is the mother of the Arab world. Egypt was the vanguard of Arab nationalism. And when Egypt, which kind of defined intellectually and culturally defined and politically defined Arab nationalism, recognized the State of Israel, brought an end to that aspiration, Arab nationalism. Arab nationalism was supposed to bring hope. Arab nationalism was supposed to address a lot of the challenges that the Arab world was facing, and Arab nationalism was also promising to bring dignity back to the Arab world. Nonetheless, most of the promises were ignored, and Arab nationalism produced nothing but bitter disappointment. And the recognition of the State of Israel by Sadat, by Egypt, not only brought an end to the secular projects, but also paved the way for an alternative kind of ideology which had the capability to provide a very simple answer for a very difficult question. And that was kind of Islamism. And of course, what I mean by Islamism is very specific. And of course, we have to be very careful to make a distinction between Islam and Islamism. What I mean by Islamism, in the broadest sense of the term, I'm talking about a political ideology that aspires to use some teachings of Islam as a guidance to condition and recondition the socio-political particularities of the society. So we're talking about a very, very specific political brand here. It's very different from, of course, it is getting inspiration from Islamic teaching, but it's different. We have to be careful. And so these three important events were extremely important. And what a lot of things that we see right now in the Middle East, a lot of things that we see right now facing us in Europe, not very far from here, are rooted in 1979. 1979, because of the success of the Iranian Revolution, also changed the balance of power in the region. The Iranian regime became kind of a militant revolutionary state, which wasn't only interested to revolutionize the internal political structure, but also to export its revolutionary zeal, its revolutionary ideology to the rest of the region. And that created a lot of reactions from certain kind of neighboring countries, including Saudi Arabia. So that was, in my opinion, the first turning point to politicize sectarian identity. Iranian Revolution and a lot of things that happened in 1979 basically brought sectarian identity into the political consciousness again. And the next turning point, and of course I have to be extremely brief, forgive me if I'm extremely selective with information and usage of history, because I have no other choices. Hopefully we have more time to get into details later on. And then the next turning point, I mean, we talked about kind of politicization of sectarian identity as the result of these events, primarily the Iranian Revolution. The next important turning point, which was kind of securitization of sectarian identity, was 9/11. 9/11 was also a kind of defining moment in the living memory, because it paved the way to certain policies which until today we see their repercussions and consequences. The most important one, as you know, obviously, was the invasion of Iraq in in 2003. Why 2003 and the invasion of Iraq kind of moved us to the next stage of kind of securitization of sectarian identity? Because, as you know, I mean, these things have been discussed a lot in the mainstream media as well over the last few months, because all of a sudden a kind of political vacuum was created in one of the most important countries in the Middle East, in Iraq. You have to remember, I mean, just like a little distraction here, that Iraq, in my opinion, never ever was or is a nation state. Most of the countries in the Middle East, basically, we see states without nations. Almost a century has passed since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Nonetheless, kind of this process of nation building in the Middle East, including Iraq, has been extremely unsuccessful. Of course, there isn't anything natural or organic about any nation state. Nation state is nothing but a political construction. It doesn't matter if you are talking about Europe or talking about the Middle East or anywhere else. Nonetheless, if you want to build a nation, it requires a lot of effort from the political elite. It requires a lot of effort generally from the elite in order to create that sense of national consciousness. Why national consciousness is important? Because national consciousness can curb pre-modern identities like sectarian identity, like tribal identity, like ethnic identity. Despite the fact that now we had a modern creature, modern phenomenon called the so-called nation state in the Middle East, nonetheless, because of the collapse and the failure of nation building, these pre-modern identities, they still could have a lot of significance and a lot of impact in these societies, because there was hardly any attempt for nation building. What we saw in Iraq before 2003 was basically reluctant nation building and statism. The state was monopolizing the power, the state was monopolizing the economic assets and the economic resources, and basically didn't like the creation or the construction of any public platform or sphere which could bring different people from different sects and different ethnicities and different linguistic backgrounds together to form a civil society, because that would potentially undermine authoritarianism and would be dangerous. So the state, in a way, was very reluctant to actively pave the way to nation building. So as long as you had a grip over everything with a ruler like Saddam Hussein, I suppose you could maintain a degree of stability, very much like Yugoslavia under Tito. But when those political structures all of a sudden go, that sense of national consciousness, that sense of national cohesion, which could kind of create a condition for that nation to survive, never existed. The sense of Iraqi consciousness, in the same way that I suppose we may understand it in the West, did not exist. After all, even in 2003, your pre-modern identities like sectarian identity or tribal identity was still more important. Of course, you still could subscribe to that Iraqi identity, but your loyalty first and foremost would go to something else. And this is extremely important. So 2003, the West goes in, and all of a sudden, the political structure, which kind of maintained the grip over every facet of the society, was gone. And when you look at some of the policies which were made in 2003 and 2004, it's just like breathtaking. Overnight, for example, United States made 400,000 trained people who were basically part of the military, unemployed. Basically, they dissolved the Iraqi military overnight, and as the result, 400,000 trained soldiers were unemployed and extremely angry. So just look at the picture. You have a political vacuum. That political bureaucracy is gone, and in addition to that, you have almost 500,000 people they have the military training, and yet you have made them unemployed and marginalized and pushed to the margin. And then, of course, I don't have enough time to get into the details about kind of that securitization of the sectarian identity, because obviously that created the platform for various segments of the society to get together primarily on on the basis of their sectarian identity in order to maximize their own interest. And this is still happening today in 2016. And the next stage that I want to talk in brief, probably I'm running out of time.
2 more minutes?
2 more?
Few more minutes. Too interesting to stop you.
Please give him a little extension.
I think we're all agreed on that.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, where were we? And then the next phase, which is also very important, I had an extensive interview about this with File on 4. It will be on in a couple of weeks, 16th of February. So if you are a Radio 4 fan, make sure that you listen to that. Not because of my interview, because it's a very interesting program about kind of the rise of sectarian kind of consciousness and the ways in which it's having an impact in countries like Britain as well. So the next phase was about mobilization. And what was the turning point for that was the so-called Arab Spring, and more importantly, the war in Syria. Syria, I keep talking about defining moments. I suppose now you're telling me that almost everything that you talked about tonight is supposed to be the defining moment in our living memory, but it is. Syria is one of the defining conflicts of the recent memory, and this is the closest thing that we had to the idea of the Third World War. This is a conflict that around 60 countries are involved in it. And the narratives that are created, constructed, engineered within the framework of this civil war, they don't know boundaries. They travel, and they travel very, very, very fast. The narratives that have been created in the Syrian civil war, the binary narratives of us versus them, black versus white, good versus evil, Shia versus Sunni, that has been created as the result of this extremely violent conflict, now obviously has a major impact on Muslim consciousness worldwide. Not only having a major impact, these kind of divisive issues on the Muslim consciousness worldwide, but also is having an impact on the ways in which we evaluate the Middle East. It is very interesting that, when I read the news, even mainstream media like the BBC, anytime they talk about any major country in the Middle East, they qualify their reference. For example, the Shiite Iran, the Shiite majority Iran, or the Sunni majority Saudi Arabia, or, I don't know, Shia majority Bahrain. This did not exist 3 years ago. And I'm Iranian myself, and it is very interesting. Over the last 2 or 3 years, I have been also put into a very kind of a specific political kind of identity. It's becoming harder and harder for me to travel in the Middle East, despite the fact that my research and I suppose my living is about the Middle East. But now, anytime I travel in some parts of the Arab world, it seems that I have to provide kind of explanation for the Iranian foreign policy or apologize on behalf of the Iranian foreign policy, because this sectarian identity is just becoming unbelievably effective. This kind of sectarian consciousness is becoming extremely kind of effective. And Syria is extremely important. Initially, Assad, from the very beginning, Assad tried to refrain from kind of these sectarian binaries because it wouldn't be in his interest. Because after all, he's representing a small minority in the country, and they have been in power for a very long time, and the vast majority of the country are Sunni. So obviously, he didn't have much interest to kind of play with these kind of binary ideologies. Nonetheless, the opposition to Assad have been primarily using this as the best possible asset to mobilize, and they have been unbelievably successful. Of course, Assad is a nasty piece of work. We don't need to provide, nobody can be in a position to defend his policies and his disrespect for human rights and extreme violation of human rights. Nonetheless, he did not kind of try to get the genie out of the bottle by using the sectarian binaries, but the opposition to him did, because this was a very effective way of turning the war, which was ultimately about power. It was a civil war between a nasty military regime and the people. But this in itself doesn't create a framework for mobilization, doesn't create an overwhelming ideology which could encourage you thousands and thousands and thousands of people to go and fight in that war and lose their lives for a cause. Portraying the war, portraying the conflict through sectarian lenses can provide, justification, can provide raison d'être for violence. And this is what we have been seeing over the last 3 or 4 years. Between 4,000 to 6,000 people have left Europe to join the so-called Islamic State. And if you can basically focus on one specific ideology within the so-called Islamic State, is sectarianism. 4,000 to 6,000 people from Europe, from the very town that I'm working in, Bradford, have left to join that organization. And then when you look at kind of the political ideology that they use and they try to kind of expand to kind of mobilize and attract people, is primarily based on sectarian and sectarianism and sectarian identity and sectarian consciousness. That's why this is unbelievably important. It is not only something that is happening in the Middle East, this is also something that is affecting us. The Syrian civil war has created the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War, and that is affecting you as well. Now Europe is more divided than any other times, at least in recent history, over what is right and what is wrong, what we should do. Should we kind of stick to our rational, security-oriented side, or should we open our hearts to basically millions of people who are absolutely desperate for help? But if we open our heart, what would be the consequences? Remember what happened a few months ago in France. But these are the dilemmas that Europe is facing, and that is all rooted in Syria. So what is happening in Syria is not only having an impact on the region, it's changing the region, it's changing the region with the speed of light, but it's also shaping and reshaping the Muslim consciousness worldwide. And as that is changing, it's also having a major impact on the ways in which we live and the ways in which you live, and actually the rest of the world as well. So this is actually more than a simple intellectual exercise to come here and provoke a few questions and talk about basically certain movements and look at their historical context. This is something that is affecting us every day. And that's why I'm in a way pleased that now the importance of sectarianism in the Middle East now is becoming to the public debate. In fact, in a stormy night, I don't know, maybe 60, 70 people are congregated here to talk about it. This in itself is a very good first step, because this should come to the public debate, and we should know more about it, and we should discuss it more. Please do forgive me. I had a captive audience. I went on and on and on and on. I'm going to shut up now, but I'm sure the platform will be open for discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Cafe Culture Northeast is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and Dance City. We're also supported by DC Cafe, who host the events.